I think people at home would love to know how on earth you managed to maintain some semblance of order in the commentary box alongside Crofty and be able to articulately tell people at home what has gone on, because so much had happened.
It was a really complicated day. I think having the qualifying in the morning was first of all, you have to say hats off to F1 and the FIA to make that happen.
17th on the grid, torrential rain and chaos everywhere. Yet Verstappen pulled off the impossible. Check it out now.
Because if we think back to 2021 in Spa, we all criticized them because there were breaks in the weather that they didn't take advantage of, and we had that fairly shambolic 2-lap race. Whereas this time they thought, okay, we need to be flexible here. We need to look at where the gaps in the weather are and make sure we can run the sessions. So they did that. And actually very few people complained, honestly, about the new schedule. I know we had to wake up early, but I'd much rather do that and make sure we have a qualifying in a race. So it was brilliant. But you're right, there was a lot going on. And also qualifying, we had 5 red flags, which was, I think, the highest we've seen, or equal highest we've seen since a few years ago. So it's qualifying alone took an hour and 45 minutes, which meant that from the end of qualifying until the pit lane opening to go to the race was only 2 hours and 45 minutes, which is less than we have on a Saturday on a normal sprint weekend, right? So it was really intense. And then we had a quali where so much happened, and we had Christian Horner and Max Verstappen really emotional, really angry about the way qualifying had unfolded. They felt they'd been the victim of some fairly biased stewarding and officials, not restarting the session in time or not red flagging it and not restarting in time to give him a lap and all this sort of stuff. So for people like us, for me to use the SkyPad and try and explain that actually it didn't matter. He was just unlucky. But, it was a huge effort for the whole team. We've got, just for people at home to know, and I know you guys know this, but we've got a team of people back in Osterley in the UK looking through onboard footage, looking through the timings, trying to help us put together these explanations of so, you first have to break down qualifying, then you sort of go, oh God, there's a race coming up. we now have to get our heads around that. And, we had all those cars in the barrier, and, Bernie, Ted and I were walking up and down the pit lane to see who might make it for the race, who won't make it, who might have to start from the pit lane. We had both Astons, we had both Williams cars and Carlos Sainz, 5 cars, a quarter of the grid, all the cars being in bits. So, yeah, there was a lot to focus on in between. But yeah, it was good.
It's fascinating how the FIA managed to adapt to the unpredictable weather. By avoiding another Spa 2021 scenario, they prioritized flexibility and delivered a full race weekend. However, the 5 red flags in qualifying highlight the fine line between keeping the sport safe and maintaining its rhythm. There's still work to do, but this was a step in the right direction.
Keeps you on your toes, doesn't it? Bernie, you were in race control. So just explain to people at home, are you logging the race? How are you able to keep, of all the people on our team, with your strategy background, you're the one probably the best at doing this. How are you keeping on top of the race and the race story and 20 individual drivers' race story, as it were?
Yeah, there's quite, in a normal race even, there's quite a lot going on and quite a lot to deal with. I sit very, very close to Corinne and Crofty, so obviously listen intently to everything that they have to say, but then trying to listen into where I can to driver radio. And just from a workload point of view, I probably listen to somewhere between 8 and 10. I don't pick up everything that's said, but you're picking up as much as you can. But then trying to replay through onboards or driver radio to figure out, little bits that you've missed, and just trying to pick up all the data that you can. And it is a pretty hectic weekend. And then at many, many points, just going back to the FIA rulebook and trying to figure out what I thought might happen next. So quite a lot of my Sunday in particular was just going through the regulations to try and figure out exactly what I thought the next steps might be. So yeah, it was really busy, but actually that's really enjoyable, I think, from a race point of view, and sort of tests us all on our knowledge of what we think might happen or what the procedures are going to be. So I think it tested even the drivers and their pit walls, particularly at the start of the race. So yeah, I find it really interesting. It's nice you've got a race like that where there's lots to play for.
It certainly came across on TV at home. It was such a enthralling whole weekend, but obviously particularly Sunday. Anyway, tell you what's coming up on the podcast. We're going to get into Max Verstappen's masterclass, going from 17th to win the race. We're going to discuss where it ranks across one of the great drives in Formula One. We're going to also get into where it leaves Lando Norris, where it leaves McLaren now in their championship battles, and talk a little bit about Alpine's day as well, and a potentially bumper payday for Alpine due to their 2-3 result in Sao Paulo. But let's get into it then. Max Verstappen, his masterclass on Sunday. I've seen all sorts of superlatives being banded around for just how good it was. I think, Kareem, what would be really good is just to start with a bit of context of how difficult that drive was from the outset, starting from 17th and going on to win in those conditions. Tell people at home how impressive that is and how remarkable his drive was.
Starting 17th in those conditions and still taking the win, doesn't that tell you everything you need to know about Max Verstappen? How many drivers could handle the chaos of the weather, the on-track incidents, and the strategic pressure and still come out on top? It's a reminder why he's redefining greatness in Formula One.
Oh, it's hugely impressive, and I think when we get days like that and conditions like that, the visibility is a huge challenge when you're starting in the pack. You are literally on the first lap driving into a wall of spray. Clearly, a lot of people were struggling with brakes and with braking and trying to get the brakes at the right temperature. Different people had one of the things that perhaps is less well known is there's a range of brake material. So sometimes you live and find two cars within the same team using different types of brake material. And there were a lot of people struggling with that. We saw the likes of Piastri, for example, very quick in the drive, very quick in the early parts of qualifying. They're just locking up in Q3 and in the race. So, but Max was the one who just seemed to find grip and confidence and just ability to make his way through the traffic, which nobody else could. We saw Lando stuck behind George, who, he felt he was quicker but couldn't get past. We saw Charles, we saw, Perez, for example, not being able to come past Lawson. We saw so many drivers just not able to come through the pack. And really, Max was the only one who could come through. But let's bear in mind, he started, was it 2 places behind Lewis Hamilton, right? And Lewis is also, as we know, a wet weather master. And on this day, it was only Verstappen who could just come through the pack. And for me, I thought he was really trying to make a statement, because once he got out in front, he didn't just hang around. It was very reminiscent of Senna Donington 93 or Schumacher Spain 96, Lewis in Silverstone 2008, where they don't just want to win, but they want to put a marker down and say, we're going to destroy the opposition and show you how far ahead we can get. And he pulled 19 seconds on the pack after, obviously, we had the late safety cars and the red flags and things like that. He just absolutely disappeared off, and it was a real big statement he made.
Verstappen's performance in Sao Paulo deserves to be compared to the iconic drives in F1 history. In a race where even seasoned wet weather specialists faltered, he delivered a flawless demonstration of car control, strategy, and pace. Once he took the lead, that 19-second gap wasn't just dominance, it was a declaration of his supremacy.
It really was. I was going to say as well, his fastest lap of 1:20.472 was more than a second quicker than any other driver. So again, just puts into context, doesn't it, how impressive it was. Bernie, if you had a driver like Max Verstappen in your team with that ability in those conditions, I mean, how much easier does that make that the possibility of doing something from 17th when you're deciding your strategy before the race? It must be unbelievable to know you have his power at your disposal.
Yeah, and I think particularly in a race like this, particularly in a race where there's going to be a lot of incidents, a lot of safety cars, a lot of opportunities to make progress as well. I think, or when you close up the field, you bring it all back together, and that is more overtaking opportunities. And we've seen this before from Max at Brazil a few years ago in the wet. He does have this ability to find grip where others do not. And the wet is notoriously hard for overtaking offline, because that part of the track is not as dry as the part of the track that you're currently on. And he makes that work. He makes that stick. And it is it's one one less thing to worry about is the getting stuck in the traffic, getting stuck behind someone when you have someone of Max's ability that's able to come through the field. And like Corinne highlighted, there were many, many others that were not able to progress. Even if you think at the end of the race, Russell against Gasly, you know, as the track was drying in what should be on paper a much stronger car, but in those conditions, just not able to make it work. So, yeah, really impressive from Max, I think. And having a fast car, be that the combination of the car or the driver, will always make your strategic choices a little bit easier.
It's the golden ticket, isn't it?
Yeah,
I guess,
it is.
for you guys on the pit wall. Karine, this is a stupid question. How hard is it to drive in the wet? What are the differences? What are the challenges of driving on a wet track compared to a dry track? If that's not such a silly question to ask.
What stands out here is how Max's ability in the wet simplifies strategy decisions. For the pit wall, knowing you have a driver who can pass in any condition, even offline, means they can focus entirely on optimizing strategy rather than worrying about traffic, a luxury very few teams have.
It's a question often people do ask after a race like this. It's, to be honest, it's an amplification of what you find on the road, right? You've just fundamentally got less grip. Driving a race car is all about staying on that. Can you see my hands? There you go. It's all about staying on that precipice, that edge of the grip versus speed, and just sort of balancing on that. Now, obviously, when you've got less grip because there's water on the track, yes, you've got less speed, but that knife edge gets even smaller. It's even harder to balance on there. And that's where I think the great drivers are able to just literally, they're balancing on one little finger almost, and they just, but they're able to stay there on that knife edge and just let the car dance around and float around, but still know they're going to be in control and hang on to it and deliver that lap time. What we saw on Sunday was, you use the word masterclass, which is the same I said on Sunday, it's you can't understate how difficult it is, I think, to do, the fact that we saw so many drivers going off and so many good drivers going off throughout the day. We saw people like Alonso ending up in the barrier in qualifying. You saw so many good drivers struggling to hang on to it and stay on track. And I don't think we ever saw, Bernie, you can correct me if I'm wrong, but I don't think I ever saw Max going off the track, like even a lockup and going off like we saw from Leclerc and people like that. He just, at no point did he seem out of control throughout that race.
Yeah, I agree, Corinne. I don't think so. And actually, I just listened to his radio back, and towards the end of the race when he's getting into setting fastest laps, his race engineer's telling him, take it easy now, it's about getting it home. And he's saying, I'm in control, don't worry about it. So he had confidence right until the end.
Can we really appreciate enough just how rare it is to see a driver like Max never even put a wheel wrong in such treacherous conditions? While others struggled to stay on track, he made it look effortless. Doesn't that confidence under pressure remind you why he's the benchmark?
Karine, just on that final point on sort of the wet driving, does practice make perfect with that? We heard Max after the race say he referenced a lot of the driving he did as a youngster when he was racing with practicing with his dad, racing with his friends, practicing different scenarios, and that in turn has helped him to get more comfortable in those conditions. Like, how much as a young driver should you be practicing in the wet? Like, is it a case of, I don't know, say you've got a race coming up and it's pouring down outside, you go, right, this would be a great opportunity. Let's go down to our local track and practice in this because we know how useful that's going to be further down the line.
It's funny, Jos Verstappen told me last year, he said because obviously he grew up in Belgium, Max did, quite close to the kart tracks there. And he said every time it was raining, he'd make sure Max kept driving around and around to the point where Max's fingers would freeze and he couldn't hold the steering wheel. And then you go, okay, now you can get out. But all the other kids and all the other parents, when it would start raining, they'd go hide in the cafe and be drinking their hot chocolates, whereas Jos would have Max out on track, driving around and around and around, and just building up that muscle memory and building up that feel, getting his nerves to think and respond in a way to understand when the car does this is how I need to react to it. And this is where that limit is of where I can react before it spins. And Senna was the same. You hear stories of people who were karting around the same era of Senna, in the sort of late 70s. And they said the same. Every time it rained, he would be the one who would run to jump in the kart and go out there and drive round and round and round to just keep building up that skill. And it is remarkable, right? To have that mental strength as a kid to want to keep driving around. I mean, we've all been to Spa on a cold, miserable, rainy day and thought, I really don't want to be standing outside and getting soaked. But that's what Max did, and that's what, Senna did, and that's what made them great.
How many drivers can truly say they've mastered wet weather driving the way Max has? Growing up, he wasn't just racing on dry tracks. He was out there, in the cold rain, pushing himself to the limit. It's this relentless pursuit of improvement that separates the legends from the rest. When we think of wet weather dominance, can we really overlook the significance of Max's early training in those harsh conditions? His story shows that being a great driver isn't just about talent, it's about the hours spent in uncomfortable situations that shape a champion.